amongst the earliest systemic therapists are Bateson, Jackson, Haley, and Weakland. They were based at the Mental Health Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. And they had a research collaboration which applied anthropology and social system theory amongst families with schizophrenia. Their proposal was in the family dynamic with schizophrenia, according to the Palo Alto group, the receiver tries to process information, and this would be in the form of a double bind, and this would correlate with the symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, to give you an example, examples come to mind. When I used to work in care homes in the education, delivering education, there was a situation one time in the care home where there was a team meeting, and you had the social worker, psychologist, and parents, and so on and so forth. And there was a meeting going on, and I sort of sat in the other room whilst the meeting was going on. My remit was to deliver education as a young person, and I got asked if I wanted to go in and sort of give my details on how the student was progressing educationally. But whilst I did that, well, interesting thing happened in the sense that we talk about the double bind, where the parent sort of stood up amidst this conversation, and he said to the young person, I love you. The words, I love you, but really, really in a forceful way. So the content was the words, I love you, but the meta-communication, which is something that the Palo Alto 4 proposed, was really aggressive. It was like I love you aggressive and fist clench, and really, really conflicting, because the content was I love you, but the meta-communication was, Finch class, face really angry, tone, the energy was really, really mean. And that's sort of an example of a double bind, to the point that, okay, later actually while I was doing I'd finished delivering education, the young person, one of the care staff, said to me, he asked for whatever reason my thoughts as to why the child would go on to say that they did love the parents and so on and so forth. What was my take on it, even though obviously they were in a very tough predicament, from my understanding anyway. And I said, well, that could be multifactorial, but one hypothesis could be that as a young person, the child needs water, shelter, basic human needs, but also love. So one hypothesis could be, this is my own opinion, and some people might share it or not share it, is that the child starts to misinterpret reality, external reality, because the child needs love from the parent. It sort of craves that love from the parent. So the child, because it craves love from the parent, maybe the child generally does love, and maybe the parents do generally love the child. I don't know. That's another story for another day. But in a situation where obviously the parents don't show that sort of affection and so on and so forth, there's a possibility that the child it believes what it thinks is going to give the child the best chance of survival. And here we go, I've got a dog running through. Hello. No worries. So we had an extra student in the class. It broke my cycle of thoughts. It's a bit of a double bind, and that wasn't set up, by the way. The child then sort of believes, or at least it wants to believe, because it thinks if the parent loves me, then I've got a better chance of survival. So that could be one hypothesis in situations where you see certain people in volatile relationships, where even though there's sort of conflicting interest. I don't know. I don't recall if this young person had schizophrenia. I'm pretty sure they may have done, but it was a long time ago. But let's sort of give you an example. So moving forward, the messages are contradictory, but they maintain the homeostatic balance in the family. So the proposal by the Palo Alto 4 was, it maintains the homeostatic balance in the family in that situation. So the double bind communication can be seen as a bit of a paradox to a point. So for example, a parent might communicate with a teenager, so the parent might say, they might have the parents may have arranged with the teenager to go to a family meal, and the evening comes along and the teenager says, for example, I'd prefer to go out with my friends this evening, as it happens. And the parent might say to the teenager, well, I don't really care what you do, it's entirely up to you. But equally, the message they send out for the body language can be the language could be innocuous, but the body language could be, okay, well, if you go, there'll be consequences, and if you don't go, there'll be consequences in relation to, okay, they might say one thing, but like I mentioned, the young person in care, it might be a different representation for the tone, the body language, and so on and so forth. So, you know, the emphasis is that is it, you know, correlation, is it causation in terms of schizophrenia? Well, I suppose that's another story for another day. My suspicion is obviously there's, you know, biology involved, and I think that is the chicken or the egg. Does the communication trigger it, or does the schizophrenia maintain the balance of that communication? I suppose that's another story for another day. But you could also make the point that you could have a highly functional person with schizophrenia who works in a college lecturing, and you could have obviously someone who's under clinical care and under heavy medication. So that's another story for another day. But that was their observation. That was their sort of force, which was quite interesting from their point of view, and it sort of broke the mold a little bit of what the consensus was of that era, at least in that area. So you could say that the double-blind communication, we see it, I suppose, people who, you maybe see narcissists come out with a lot of that sort of communication, probably more than the general person. Politicians too, sales as well. So a couple of examples, whilst I don't sort of want to go into this in too much detail, so I only got a short time to sort of put the theory out there. But you might see a couple in a relationship, and one member of the relationship might say to the person, well, I want you to quit university, or we'll get a separation. Or it might be quit your job or get a divorce. So there's no real outlet. There's no real way out of that sort of bind in that respect. So a salesperson might say, well, you can pay now by card or interest-free later. So in the end, it's the sort of outcome is generally about making the sale. But it also, you know, you see people using it from a positive point of view, and you know, certainly in some of the language patterns, you see the double bind. It could be used in a coercive, positive way. You could say, well, you might feel good now, or great later, or you may be successful at presenting tomorrow, you may be fantastic in a week. So you can give people options, alternatives, and that's another story for another day. But you can see how it can be quite paradoxical, in the sense that one thing is being said, maybe even out of context, but their hypothesis, the Palo Alto group, they would suggest that all behavior is communication. You've got the surface level, which is the content. So I mentioned before, the parents and the boy, I love you. And then you got the intent, and the intent being the meaning of the communication, what it entails. And I read a book one time, and I don't recall, let's just come to mind again. If you've read the book before, do send it through. I don't recall where I read this, in which book or which research paper. If you've read it before, and you're familiar with this process, do email me. I wouldn't mind reading it again. But they talk about how the mother goes to pick up the son, I think it was, from the mental institution, if that's the political correct way of putting it these days. But anyway, the child had schizophrenia and got better, and the child ran up to the mother to give her a hug, and she'd dropped her arms and says to the child, do you not love me no more? And then the child withdrew as well. So you can see how content is one thing, the intent is another. And their hypothesis was that it maintains the homeostatic balance in the family with the schizophrenia, and you've got these two conflicting messages, which can be emotional distressing in the sense where it's a bit like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. There's really no resolution. I suppose you could put it as the double bind as a form of coercion, control without coercion. It's difficult to respond to. Now, how does one respond to quit university or separation or quit the job or get a divorce, or even the sales technique where you can pay now interest free or pay whatever, so you can see how it can be quite challenging and it can be quite emotionally distressing. I suppose my take on the on the Palo Alto 4, their sort of theory in the family, my take on Bateson, Jackson, Haley and Weakland's theory, I think it's called schizophrenia. I guess is multifactorial, and in my opinion anyway, in my understanding of it, it's not necessarily a biological diagnosis. It's, depending on, so you've got the DSM diagnosis, which has a criteria, and that's another story for another day. So in one sense, I think that it probably would be hard to distinguish whether there's a correlation or causation, or is it chicken or the egg, but no doubt that has been proven to go on in families in that sort of environment. But to sort of suggest it's causative for me, in my opinion, there probably isn't enough evidence to suggest that. But obviously, with the techniques we've got in the world we live in these days, in neuroscience, you've got the capability to sort of look at the mind and blood flow and MRI, fMRI, and people are getting a better understanding of mental health, if we want to call it that in general, which is another story for a day. But this was my proposal to sort of put forward the double bind theory, which was in the 50s developed by, that's my sort of spin on it, the Palo Alto for Bateson, Jackson, Haley, Weakland, who were, you could probably argue, say that amongst the first, if not the first, systemic family therapist. So thank you for watching. Live with passion. Boom.